All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lauren Neal, and I'm the Marketing Manager and Automation Specialist here at Quorum. And Quorum is the leading provider of one-click instant recovery. So today we are presenting How to Take the Headache Out of an IT Audit, presented by Gabe Gambill. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll bring them up at the end of the presentation where we will have Q&A. This webinar is also being recorded. Attendees will be emailed a link to the webinar after the recording after the webinar. Excuse me. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Gabe. Our presenter today is Vice President of Product and Technical Operations here at Quorum, and he has worked in IT for over 20 years. Gabe specialized in full IT disaster recovery services for financial institutions across the U.S. and managed everything from risk assessments and audits to firewall and everything in between. So, Gabe?
Thanks a lot. Glad everybody's here to attend. What we're going to talk about today is how to really survive an audit or how to best prepare for an internal or external IT audit. And it kind of goes through a couple of steps. We have the hunt, basically what the auditors are looking for, the evidence that they're going to be asking you for, the gaps that you're invariably going to find when you face an audit, and then the ruling and how they come up with what they give you for the audit and how you address any deficiencies post-audit. And then we'll have a little Q&A afterwards to answer any questions you guys might have, and we'll kind of go from there. Before I go into the hunt, just a little bit more about myself. As Lauren had said, I've been working in IT forever. And in my past position, I worked with a managed service provider that works specifically with community banks. So in doing that, we went through countless IT audits, FDIC audits, third-party audits, and you kind of get a feel for how the audit rolls, what the questions they ask for. And so in doing all of that, I've kind of come up with a good sense of how to really attack an audit to give you the best chance for success. So what are the auditors really looking for? Well, what they're really looking for is policies and procedures. And depending on what type of audit you're going through, whether it's just an internal audit or a third-party audit, or whether you're going for a certification or some kind of classification where you're doing COBIT or PCI, HIPAA, something like that, they ask really that what they want are your policies and procedures. And what they do if you're going for a certification is they want to make sure your policies and procedures are in line with what the requirements are for whatever that certification is. But it's interesting because those requirements in most cases are a very gray area. I've worked with banks that have had specific policies to make sure they back up email for 10 years. And I've worked with banks that have policies that say they don't want to back up email for various reasons we'll talk about later. And so when you go through the audit, it's more a question of, am I adhering to my policies and procedures, and are they in line with what the national standards are? The next thing you have is controls. And what controls really means are who's doing what, who's responsible for what. We had an IT group of over 100 people working for us. And if we were to say we had 100 IT administrative accounts in every bank, we would have failed every audit. So controls are who has access to what servers, what files, what parts of the bank, to make sure that there's a separation of duties, so that there's not one golden key or that something doesn't leak out. It's definitely a way to help reduce that security flaw. The proof and evidence. So every time you say we log every customer that logs into a server, they want to see that log file. They want to see that evidence that you're doing what you say you're going to do. And that's probably the single hardest thing that I see for most of our customers when they go through an audit, is actually providing all of that proof and having it in a succinct, readable format for the auditors. Because what they'll often do is they'll give them their full, for example, firewall logs. And what you've done is you ask them to basically audit every ACL in your firewall versus who's accessing what. And so not that it makes your audit worse, but it does make your audit longer. And the longer that they're there, obviously the more expensive your audit can be, but the more things that they're going to be having time to look for. And last but definitely not least, preparation, not procrastination. Being prepared for your audit is the number one thing I can stress to you. And in doing that, what I mean is, the audit is an annual event for most people, or every 18 months, depending on what audit you're going through, or even 2 years. But your preparation for your audit should be an annual. It should be a monthly thing, or a continuous thing that you're always working to provide up-to-date materials. What we do with our customers is we split their audit up. So we say, okay, in an FDIC audit, they might be giving, I don't know, maybe 400 pieces of evidence. You have your policies and procedures, you have all your stuff. Breaking that up to be reviewed on a regular basis versus trying to do it all right before your audit or even during your audit is definitely best. So we would break it up into monthly segments. And then what we would do is we would have those parties that were important to whatever segment we were looking at in those meetings, and we would do it on a regular basis so that it's more digestible for us to get through. To give you an example, I went through an FDIC audit probably a decade or so ago, and my auditor, I kid you not, his name was Chuck Bonesteel, and there was no man that sent fear down the spines of an IT bank auditee than Chuck. Chuck was an amazing guy because he was never mean, he was never gruff about when he did audits, but he was always very, very exacting. He knew what the rules were, he knew what you had to get to, and if you said you did something, he wanted to know about it. And so we went through these things over and over, and after a couple of years, in fact, I ended up working with him for a short time after he retired from the FDIC, but after a couple of years, you kind of got the cadence for Chuck when he went through an audit to understand that if, especially for us, because we managed multiple banks, if we did it for one bank, he wanted to see it for all the banks. So it really helped us to get our policies and procedures streamlined to provide him that data. And he came up with that suggestion for us to break it up into monthly segments. So if you break up your audit into monthly segments and say, right, this time we're going to go through the land-WAN diagram, and this month we're going to go through the policies and procedures for authentication or background checks or whatever it is, it really helps break up that problem. When we go through the policies and procedures, speaking of that, the goal when you have a policy is that A, it's written. Just because you said to do something doesn't mean it's a policy. And so you got to have everything written down. It's got to be reviewed on a regular basis, and it's got to be updated. So when you go through an audit, what you'll find is they might question one of your policies. They might come in and say, oh, when you go through, I don't know, your HIPAA compliance audit, they might say, I noticed that you make a copy of data from here and you copy it to a tape or whatever to send it off site. Is that part encrypted? Or, does it have a padlock, or is it a key lock on the box that you send it off site in? It's little details that they'll look for, because in every audit I've ever been in, every single one, no matter how prepared you feel you are, the auditor will find something. And what you do by being more prepared is you basically prepare the auditors better for their next audit. So they're always knowing what to look for next. So don't feel bad when they come back with deficiencies in your audit, because that's part of their job. And so the next thing, and this goes especially for things like PCI or HIPAA, when you're going through an audit that's for a certification, they don't only look at what your policy says, but they make sure that it follows the general best practices as the industry has evolved. And that's where reviewing your audit and your policies becomes critical, because they're looking for that quality of your policy. They want to make sure that, 5 years ago, your policy wouldn't probably even have a reference to ransomware, but today you better have a whole section dedicated for it. how you handle it, how you address it, how you resolve it, because that's going to show up in an audit question for sure nowadays. So the things they look for general best practices: quality of your policies, performance of your network. Are you maintaining your, whatever it is you say, 5 nines or 2 nines, whatever it is you're promising for performance. And then the big section is going to be on security. Are you ensuring that your data is encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit? Are you ensuring that you're limiting who has access to your network? There's an ever increasing number of regulatory requirements for privacy and fiduciary control and other concerns. And so, controlling that and knowing what your security risks are is important. So doing your penetration testing and all of that stuff. I'll give you an example. This is long time ago when Wi-Fi was a new thing. We went to a credit union, and what we do is we would come into these banks or these credit unions, and we would do a security audit for them before they went into any kind of FDIC or in this case credit union, the whatever it is, CCNL audit or whatever it's called. And what we did is they just installed Wi-Fi, and they put this thing up in their window saying, hey, free Wi-Fi access, while you're in the bank, promoting this as a feature to join their credit union. And we sat in the parking lot, we hacked into the Wi-Fi. We then used a rootkit on their Active Directory server. We got their president's password, and then we went in and had the meeting. And we said, oh, John, your password is this. And it's because they hadn't separated their Wi-Fi from their internal network. They had just made basically a free route to the internet off of it, but it actually did have access to some of their servers internally, and we used that as a gateway. Obviously, in today's day and age, that would never happen because that would show up in an audit in a heartbeat. But those are the type of things that having these policies and procedures help you to evolve. And if you have the same policy and procedures now that you had 5 years ago, it's probably time for you to review them because there should be other things added. The evidence. Oh, the evidence. Mountains and mountains. I say this with the most humble of things. For a PCI audit, for example, we had over 100 documents that we supply for the auditors, and it's one we're going through our annual audit right now, actually. My best advice is to split your docs up and review them monthly. Policies are easy. There's tons of examples online on how to build your policy base. Once written, reviewing them is not hard. But on the same token, your land-WAN diagram probably changes more than you realize, and it probably gets updated the day before the auditors show up, and it's probably not finished, and it's probably having servers missing from it and all kinds of problems. That really, that's one of those little catches that raises the red flag for the auditor, because if you don't have that updated, chances are you don't have other documentation updated, and they tend to start digging in more. The picture's worth 1,000 words really does resonate with things like your land-WAN diagram. Remember to include your other IT people when you're having your meeting to review your documents. Or if it's a business policy, make sure you have your business manager in there. Make sure if it's an HR policy, you have your HR manager in there. Even though we're talking mostly here about IT audits, a lot of audits do tend to fall into a business category, and being prepared for that as well is important. A good example is when we go through our PCI audit, all of our people have background checks done. Well, that's all done by HR. And so if I don't have the HR person, how do I know that they're still doing what they say they're going to be doing and all of that stuff? It's better to be prepared than to be caught off guard because we had a new HR manager show up and they stopped doing it and didn't tell anybody. So those are the kind of things you want to make sure you're doing. Obviously, we're a DR, disaster recovery company. I can't stress this enough to you. Do your DR test as a scenario. A lot of people do the file recovery and the server recovery, and they call their DR test a day. If you're not doing a scenario-based DR test, you're basically going to struggle in your audit because they're going to look at it saying it's not sufficient. for example, we once had a bank that did an alien invasion scenario. And really what they were trying to do is they were trying to say if you had to work from home, but they called it alien invasion to get all of their employees to just actually read through the scenario so they knew what they were testing and what they were doing and how it would all work. And it actually became more of a game for the company than the drudgery of a DR test. But it was very successful and very, very well done because it had everybody involved. Stupid, really, but a valid test. Risk assessments, again, this kind of starts to step out of the area of true IT test, but knowing that risk assessment is important. Having those checks and balances. We did a risk assessment. It's so ironic. We did a risk assessment, and one of the questions the auditor asked us, which caught us completely off guard, this is over a decade ago, but it caught us completely off guard. They said, is your executive board ever fly on the same plane? And we were like, well, yeah, we all went off site to such and such and had a meeting. They're like, from now on, you can't have everybody on the executive board on the same airline, because if that were to crash, the whole company would fold. And so that was one of those risk assessment questions we ended up adding in because we were so caught off guard by the logic of that and not even having thought that through. Now to the nitty gritty, proof documents. Auditors love logs, files, but my advice is give them excerpts of what they ask for. Don't give them the full log. It'll save you time in your audit, and it will save them time in auditing. They don't want to have to go hunt and peck. If they're hunting, they're going to look for other things, and why open yourself to that? I know that sounds kind of sketchy, and you should try to give them everything you can, but you want to manage them as much as they're managing the audit. It will help you in the long run, and honestly, they're a little relieved because it looks like you have your ducks in a row when you give them the exact excerpts of your logs for what they need. You give them the whole file, but you directly point to the pieces they need so that they don't have to go hunting for it. Your attendance sheets for your security awareness trainings, you got to have your diagrams, your change controls. Hopefully you're logging all your change control activity. That's one of the things we see a lot of customers fail in their audit, especially in smaller IT companies where they only have 2 IT guys. You know, if Bob didn't log in, then Steve did. And it's very easy for them to say they don't need a log, or they say they're manually going to do it and they try to track it in a spreadsheet, and that lasts for a month. But a year later, you only have a month's worth of logs, and you're finding yourself in a horrible situation trying to generate that stuff. So have a good change control process in place. Have it be as automated as possible. In fact, every tool that you use for your audits, whether it's your logging tools, your security tools, your testing, all the stuff that you can do, the more you can automate and the more you can simplify the process, the better off you're going to be. The gaps, the most problem areas in an audit. Boy, I go through this a lot. The biggest issue that you have is staff changes and ownership. You know, especially in larger IT groups, enterprise companies, they get, on average, IT turns over 25% year on year. So if you have 4 people, chances are one of them has changed this year. And if that change has happened and they were assigned to parts of your audit to be responsible for, you have to make sure that the new guy is responsible for that. And it sounds so easy, but what we found very often is they're so involved in training the new guy on how to do his job, they forget that auditing aspect of it, and it sits there vacant. And then they get to their audit and they're like, oh yeah, Bob, you got to do all this work. Sorry, we didn't tell you before. It's never a good situation. Environment changes, that's obvious. It's amazing how much a server environment changes year on year. You know, being in IT for as long as I have, I even today, I still think, oh, our servers are all the same. I mean, we got our Exchange server and our mail server. Yep, but versions have changed. We've done upgrades. We've migrated platforms. We've virtualized. All of those things have changed, and those all have an effect. You know, are the new security features installed? Are the audits and the proxy or the firewall grabbing the traffic that's coming through correctly still? Are the LAN diagrams updated? Are the backups correct? Are the logs for the tapes correct? All of those things really start to play a factor. And then you come into the next step, which is the testing piece. And have you rewritten your scenarios for how you're going to test those things, or your risk assessments? If I lost this server, your DR planning, your BCP, all of those, every change you make, all of those are affected. We had a customer in the UK. They were going through their DR test, and they found that they had made a small change, ever insignificant, to the firmware of their production SAN, and they found out that it had replicated some kind of bad signature to their DR thing, and none of their servers would actually boot. And they're in the middle of their audit. They couldn't do a test at that point. It's too late. And they ended up having to scrap their whole test and start all over. Never a good situation. So knowing those environmental changes is really important. In small organization, it's separation of duties, as I alluded to before. You know, if you have 2 IT guys in your department, you still have to separate between the 2, and it will become frustrating because you'll say, oh, I wish I could help you with that, but I need Steve to do that part. And it becomes very, very hard. And then you get into the log controls, and you have the manual spreadsheets that you're trying to capture things in, or you're trying to get all these disparate things and create a solid picture. You know, one of the things we see is you get asked for your VPN logs. They want to know all the users that have VPN'd, when they VPN'd, and all of that. And a normal firewall doesn't hold that for more than 30 days. And so if you needed a year of that data, you're out of luck. And so you've got to be able to know that you got to hold all that data. And small IT departments are really lax in that because they don't have a logging server usually. They have a firewall, and you're lucky they have one. They might not even have the intrusion prevention, intrusion detection stuff going on inside and outside of that firewall. They might just have a firewall. So having all of those log controls in place becomes the biggest gap that we see with small organizations. Last but not least is testing. Especially in small organizations, they are worked, they are overworked, they are usually too small of a group for the amount of servers or users that they're providing the service for. And so testing gets put on the back burner, or it gets reduced to the minimums, and they find that when they do a full DR test, it fails. Small organizations really, really have their hands full when it comes to trying to be audited. It's almost worth having a person come in separate from the IT team that controls all the auditing aspects. And I know that's a huge expense for the company, but it's something definitely to consider and to look into. The ruling. So as I said before, they're gonna find a deficiency in your audit. It's going to happen. That's why they're paid what they're paid and why they do what they do. And so being able to address that is important. And here's the secret. You know, the auditors don't want you to fail. They don't take a personal joy. I mean, that's not true. I did know one that did take a personal joy in making banks really kind of crunch. But most auditors, they don't want you to fail. They just want the data to be safe and secure. They want to make sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do, and you're providing the service you say you're going to provide. And that becomes the critical path for most of the auditors. They do it over and over and over again, and they know exactly what to look for. They know what questions to ask, and you just got to be honest. You're better off telling them if you don't have something than, you know, doing the ever so horrible thing of what we've seen some customers do, is just make up data. It's never a good thing. The auditors will sniff that out. So depending on your gap, obviously your reconciliation for that is going to be different. Most reconciliation is document related or evidence related. In large companies, it's because they made changes and they didn't track those changes, or they didn't test against those changes. And in the small companies, undoubtedly, it's a lack of resources. They just don't know what always to look for. very few small banks, when they have very few IT people, go through their audit unscathed. It's just a fact. And so it becomes an issue of controlling your resources and managing to the audit versus managing to the fire that's going on right now sometimes. And I know that's hard to say with a straight face, but it is a fact. And that's when I come back to my rule of thumb is always, preparation, not procrastination. Set up a monthly meeting, break up your documentation, break up your diagrams, break up your ownership, break up your skill sets, break up your control groups, break up your testing, and go through those on a monthly basis at a minimum. Some of our larger banks, they have a weekly planning meeting where there's a guy that's in charge of the IT audit, and he just basically pulls the people in he wants every week, and he says, right, we're going to focus on this week, and he disrupts those little bits of the world, but he makes sure everything's ready for that auditor when they come in at the end of the year. Well, that's really the gist of what I was trying to get through with you guys today. I have a lot of time here for any questions that you guys might have, or anything else that might be going on that you want me to fill in gaps for that you're having with any of your audits that you're going through. If there's anything we can do, let us know. Lauren, did you have any questions that came in?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. So just a reminder, be sure to type your questions into the question box in your control panel. We do have a few questions, so let's start out. Let's see here. All right, James asks, what tools should I use?
What tools should you use? Well, there's lots of tools out there. If you were using something for logging your data, as robust as you can afford is what I'm going to say. Some customers, they just get the simple free sysloggers that grab data off of their network stuff, but they don't grab stuff off of their event logs, or they'll grab various things. You want something, and I hate to use product names because I don't want to endorse anybody here, but you need something like a SolarWinds or something like a Splunk that's going through and looking at all of the logs that it can get its hands on, so you have a consistent path to all that. If you're talking about your DR logs or your DR planning and stuff, having a good DR solution is really the first step to that. And so obviously, because I work with Quorum, I'm going to tell you Quorum is that solution. But there's lots of tools out there. I would say my best advice to you is ask your auditors, especially if they find a deficiency in one of your areas. Hey, what tool would you recommend to do for this? They're not biased. For the most part, they're definitely not paid by any of the tool makers. So they'll give you the unbiased view of, well, this is what we see works best. That would probably be my best advice for whatever scenario you're facing. Anything else, Lauren?
Yes, we have two more questions here. The first one, how often do I need to test disaster recovery?
If I could say every day, I would, especially if you have automated testing, which a lot of the solutions out there do have nowadays. So I would say testing as much as you possibly can. But I would do a full scenario test at least once a year. If you are a bigger company, I would recommend quarterly because you're going to have more change. Smaller companies, you might do every 18 months, depending on what your audit cycle is. But a DR test should involve not just testing the servers and what's there, but they should also involve bringing in the different user groups. So if you're a bank, bringing in your tellers, or if you're a hospital, bringing in your nurses and your doctors, and have them run their applications through your test scenario to make sure that they can do the functions that they need to do at the performance levels they need to do them. What we see a lot of our customers do is they'll do their test on just one transaction and call it a day, but when they realize that they need to have 40 users on there doing that transaction and the server comes to a crawl, it's better to do a full DR test when you get the chance.
All right, and then the last question that we have here, do you have any templates to follow?
Yeah, good question. We've added a DR template into the handout, so you guys are all welcome for that, and I'm sure Lauren will send that out to you afterwards. Online, there are hundreds of templates out there. I would recommend that you focus on the specifics of your audit to find the template that works best for you. While most audits are really, really similar, there are a few regulatory changes between audits that you should be aware of. So if you're doing one of the more stringent audits like PCI versus one of the less stringent audits like COVID, I would say to make sure you have the PCI regulations templates that you use to make sure that you're covering everything. So for example, the COVID audit, they look for you follow your policies, or, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley, I always mess that name up. They make sure you're doing what you say you're going to do. Now, what you say you're going to do could be insane. We had a bank that said, we don't want a backup exchange, right? They were 100% sure that they didn't want a backup exchange. Well, they were a shaky bank from the get-go, in my opinion. They all they did is basically allowed people to come in and transfer money. They held very little accounts and very little cash. And so the fact that they weren't holding email was always a little worrisome to me, but they would pass their audits because that was their policy. Now, since then, the FDA now, or what's the new FDIC audit called? FDA? Something like that. Anyway, they're more stringent on that, and they make sure you do have general best practices in place where they didn't many years ago. But a lot of those audits basically ask you to do what you say you're going to do. And that becomes the critical path, whereas the compliance ones, they really want you to follow the general best practices that the industry has put forth. Anything else?
Okay, well, and it actually looks like we've covered all of our questions. Gabe, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I'll just put it out there to you. For going through audits, as you know, ironically, I'm going through one right now. We're doing our annual PCI audit right now. The best advice I can give to you is to be prepared well before the audit gets there. It does make life a lot easier. We've been working on our audit over the last year, and it really helps to walk into these meetings and have your binder full of documentation versus waiting for them to ask for documentation. It reduces their time on site, and it just really eases all of the strain that you're going to feel is being prepared for that. So my best advice is to be prepared. If you're running late to the party and you've just stepped into a mess and you're about to go into an audit, all I'm going to say is tell the auditor that up front. Be honest with them and say, look, this is where we're at. We know we've got gaps. Let's get through this audit. Let's get them identified so that we can get them addressed. And the auditor will appreciate that because they know that not everybody's perfect and walks into these audits totally prepared. And so they want to know the truth. They don't want to have to suss it out. That will help everyone involved, and it will help you get to reconciliation faster, which is your ultimate goal in doing your audit. Other than that, everybody, I hope you had a good day. If you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to email or reach out to us. Lauren, do you have anything else?
Yeah, just want to say thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day. We appreciate you being here. Just as a reminder, as Gabe mentioned, we have a copy of our disaster recovery playbook in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. If you have any other questions, please reach out to us. You can email us or visit our website at quorum.com and click on the Contact Us button. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.